During the most recent episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, former Obama Attorney General Eric Holder puts the GOP on blast for their anti-democratic impulses and efforts, even as top Republicans openly conspire on the Fox propaganda network to suppress voter turnout before the election. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we have several clips to play in this video, but we're actually going to start with the Fox one first. This is the Fox Propaganda Network, Fox News, and on it is Reince Priebus, a guy who's not a household name, but sounds like a Bond villain. And he used to be Donald Trump's chief of staff, as well as the chairman of the Republican National Committee. So he was intimately involved, not just with the Trump administration, but also trying to get Republicans elected or reelected. And you can see right off the bat, the goal is not about appealing to more voters or, running on a more popular agenda, but instead about suppressing voter turnout by making it harder and less convenient to vote.
At the same time, following these court cases, going back to pre-COVID laws so that we don't have a gazillion mail-in ballots going out to people that didn't or don't want them or didn't request them, and they need to lock down the voting procedures in these states.
Why? Why do that unless you are tacitly admitting that you can't compete if maximum or eligible voter turnout is maximized, which that's my argument against the Republican Party, but they're tacitly conceding that here. Why do we need to return to pre-COVID conditions when COVID made it more convenient to vote and also made it safe and secure? Republicans will say, well, it's not safe and secure, to which the rest of us should say, prove it. You need to prove that mail-in ballots, absentee ballots meaningfully contribute to the insecurity of an election. There is no evidence to suggest it. And as a matter of fact, to the extent that people have gotten busted with voter fraud, it's as likely to happen from Republican voters as Democratic voters, right? So they're essentially, it's a problem, it's a solution in seek of a problem, right? The fact of the matter is they want to make it more inconvenient to vote so that it will deter voters, so that it increases the chance that they will win elections. Very anti-democratic stuff. And Eric Holder, President Obama's former attorney general, calls him out on it.
Mr. in order, I read this committee that you're part of, or head of the redistricting committee, made it that we had the best, most fair elections in 2022 as far as redistricting that we've had ever.
In the last 40 years.
40 years, and it's going to be even better in 24?
Yeah.
So how did you get that done?
We had a state-by-state strategy, and we decided we'd use different strategies in different states, electing people who would stand for fairness, putting in place independent commissions to draw the lines, and then bringing lawsuits where we had to do that. So we used the courts as well as the electoral process to make the system more fair.
And in this clip, he's referring specifically to gerrymandering as well, which is itself an anti-democratic practice. And before I play the clip where he calls out the Republicans, I do want to say this. I'm going to use Wisconsin as an example. Now, I've done a video about multiple videos about the Wisconsin electoral maps because, according to multiple polls, multiple experts, the voting maps in Wisconsin, which is a relatively purple state, we're talking about for every one Republican-leaning or conservative voter, you can find a Democratic-leaning or progressive voter. As a matter of fact, it tends to skew just slightly more towards the left and towards Democrats. They've been heavily gerrymandered for years. Political experts across the aisle have said Wisconsin's voting maps under Republicans are the worst in the country. And it has been an uphill climb to try to get those corrected. I mean, this is a state that went for, Obama, it went for Trump, it went for Biden in the most recent election, so it has a history of swing voters. They have a Republican senator and a Democratic senator, right? And so, just right down the middle, right? And yet internally, in terms of their legislative their internal politics, they basically have a conservative supermajority or damn close to it. And it's because of how they've drafted the maps of how to vote, right? So the 50%, the Republicans who represent 50% of Wisconsin control effectively a supermajority because of bad faith gerrymandering. Now, because a liberal judge won the most recent Wisconsin Supreme Court race, there was a Supreme Court case which followed, which effectively nullified the GOP's highly gerrymandered voting maps, thanks to Justice Janet Protasewicz. Now, as a reminder, in a nutshell, this is the aftermath. This refers to the new maps. This article says, redistricting experts hired by the court, said Governor Evers, a Democrat, his maps are slightly tilted towards the Republicans. So even this new relatively fair set of maps slightly favors the GOP, but competitive enough that the party that wins the most votes will win the most seats in the legislature. Since 2011, that hasn't been the case in Wisconsin. Under Republican maps drawn that year and refined in 2021, the GOP majority in the Wisconsin Assembly has swelled to a 64-35, a near supermajority. Using data from Wisconsin's 2022 elections, Marquette University Law School research fellow John Johnson utilized computer modeling to measure the number of assembly seats leaning in Republicans or Democrats' favors under the new maps. His data shows that 42 assembly districts favoring Democrats by more than 10 percentage points and another 4 seats favoring Democrats by single digits. It also shows 46 assembly seats favoring Republicans by more than 10 percentage points, with 7 additional seats favoring Republicans by single digits. Okay, so even these fair maps passed by a Democratic governor and only allowed because of a liberal majority in the Wisconsin Supreme Court still favors the Republicans. That's how much the GOP is graded on a curve in this country. And that's to the extent that they have institutional advantages. It still goes that far. Fair is still when we give them a slight lead. Now, this is the clip in which Eric Holder debunks, or shall I say, shatters notions of both sidesism in terms of Republicans and Democrats gerrymandering.
Okay, so both sides do gerrymander, though. Right. Is that correct? I mean,
it's true, but I think if you look at what the Republicans did in 2011, Princeton University did a study and said it was the worst gerrymandering of the last 50 years. And comparing what Democrats do in terms of gerrymandering as opposed to Republicans is like comparing a pea to a watermelon.
Is it really that different?
Yeah.
Well, then what? Okay, but I have read about places that were gerrymandered for the Democrats. So if they both do it, what do you say to people who would argue, well, how can you have the moral high ground? It sounds to me like the other side just does it better.
Well, no, because I've stood against Democrats who actually did gerrymander. I stood against Democrats in Maryland. I stood against Democrats in New Jersey and Virginia who wanted to use the power that they had to try to gerrymander. And I've said that the maps, for instance, in Illinois were not maps that I necessarily would have drawn. So what we have tried to do at the NDRC is to stand simply for fairness. Here's the deal. If the system is fair, if the maps are fair, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. We don't have to put our thumb on the scale. Republicans have made peace with the notion they're going to be a minority party in terms of popular support, but they want to have majority power. And that's what we have to fight against.
100%. We talked about this. The Republican Party is not interested, just like we played in that clip from Reince Priebus on the Fox Propaganda Network. They're not interested in courting more voters. That's hard. It would require them to change their rhetoric, change their policy. Instead, they're just trying to shrink the electorate effectively. And it's disgusting, right? But also, I think it's an interesting question. If both sides do it to one extent or another, how do you have the moral high ground? Well, again, I think the disparity makes that moral high ground very clear. When Democrats in Wisconsin, with a liberal Supreme Court and a liberal governor, they had the opportunity to push for much more aggressive maps than what they did. But instead, they settled on maps which still favored the GOP. So to the extent that Democrats have an instinct to gerrymander, it's just simply nowhere near as prevalent or as vicious as it is within the Republican Party. And I'm sorry, that is a meaningful, important distinction to note. The GOP is just objectively worse, far worse. In terms of gerrymandering and anti-democratic instincts, in comparison, the Democrats are like the common cold, and Republicans are stage 4 cancer in terms of the severity of that instinct. But Will Stencil, who is this liberal data analyst, I think he's running for office in Minnesota, he talks about gerrymandering. He says, listen, elect me and I'll do it. He says, I will do everything in my power to gerrymander the living daylights of Minnesota until the Supreme Court cries uncle and makes partisan gerrymandering illegal. And he says, listen, here's the thing. Either gerrymandering is fair game, in which case both sides should do it, or it isn't, in which case neither should do it. Since Republicans insist on doing it, Democrats need to respond in kind until both sides agree to a truce. I completely agree. I'm sorry, I don't believe in unilateral disarmament. I wish and would want a world in which neither side gerrymanders. And I don't mind us taking the first step towards it, but Republicans have to take the second step. And if they don't take that second step, then Democrats should take 2 steps back. We can't have a system which we see again and again and again, where Democrats continuously act in good faith, Republicans cynically act in bad faith, and then punish us for it. You can't have a functioning system in which only one party plays by good faith. If you and I are having a conversation and you act in good faith and I act in bad faith, by definition, we had a bad faith conversation. By definition, we both have to reciprocate. And Republicans are terrible at reciprocity with respect to democratic instincts and democratic efforts. So Democrats need to play very aggressively, in my opinion. I disagree with the former attorney general in that respect. I think that a Will Stencil approach is actually more appropriate and completely justified. But at the end of the day, Republicans are openly conspiring to suppress voter turnout, either through gerrymandering or changes in election laws and voting laws, in order to win elections. They don't want to campaign on a popular agenda, popular policies, or anything like that. And we have to be vigilant and prepare accordingly. Let me know what you think in the comments.